I'd like to welcome all of you present tonight in the Grand Ballroom, and also those of you who are logged in via the internet for our lecture online. All of the Flagler Museum's lectures are webcast live streaming, but also they're archived so that you can listen later if you'd like to revisit the lecture. They're all available at thegildedagechhistorychannel.com. Before we start, I'd like to thank the sponsors for the Kiss of the Oceans exhibition and also for this lecture tonight: PNC Wealth Management, Enterprise Holdings Foundation, Florida Division of Cultural Affairs, the Cultural Council of Palm Beach County Board of Commissioners, and Palm Beach County Tourist Development Council. Without sponsors like this, we wouldn't be able to do great programming like this, so we're very thankful. And thanks also to the Education Department and the Education Director for organizing this lecture for us tonight. I'd like to take this opportunity to please ask you to turn off your cell phones or anything else you have that might make noise during the lecture. And for our speaker tonight, Dr. Julie Greene. She's a professor of history at the University of Maryland at College Park. She received a PhD in history from Yale University, an MA from Cambridge University, and a BA from the University of Michigan. She's the author most recently of The Canal Builders, Making America's Empire at the Panama Canal from 2009. A terrific read, by the way. The Organization of American Historians awarded The Canal Builders its James A. Rawley Prize for the best book on the history of race relations. She's published widely on topics in labor history. Her current book project, which sounds really interesting, examines the building of America's empire at the end of the 19th century with a focus on the labor force. Dr. Greene has received fellowships from organizations such as the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Humanities Center, and the American Council of Learned Societies. She currently serves as president of the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and she's co-founder and co-director of the Center for the History of the New America at the University of Maryland, a center dedicated to generating knowledge of the history of global migrations. The Flagler Museum organized the Kiss of the Oceans exhibition in honor of the centennial of the Panama Canal's opening in August of 1914. The canal's long been considered one of the greatest engineering feats of all time. Coincidentally, Henry Flagler's Oversea Railroad, built at the same time, has also been called one of the world's greatest engineering feats. And both projects were at the same time referred to as the eighth wonder of the world. The Panama Canal is generally discussed in terms of engineering, technological, and medical triumphs. But some of the major challenges facing the Americans when taking over the canal project were recruiting, managing, and preserving the workforce, as many as 45,000 workers at a time. Tonight's lecture, The Canal Builders, Making America's Empire at the Panama Canal, will delve into the fascinating story of the canal's labor force. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Greene.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Tracy, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's really thrilling for me to be here to talk about my favorite subject in such a spot as this. The gorgeous Flagler Museum is just so inspiring for somebody like me who focuses her research on this period. I spent a wonderful day today touring the museum and seeing the incredible Kiss of the Oceans exhibit. I suppose many or most of you have seen it. And to be here in this room, it's a little hard for me to compete with this decor. And in fact, I was saying earlier to Tracy that, I usually give lectures in dusty university halls, and now I'm afraid I'm rather spoiled. I'm going to be demanding Gilded Age mansions whenever I give my talk. But really it's very thrilling, and I want to thank those who helped to bring me here and who have shown me such a warm welcome on this journey. So thank you very much to Tracy Kammer, Janelle Troll, Allison Goff, and John Blades. It's been wonderful working with all of them. I wonder if anyone here has been through the canal or spent time in Panama? Yeah, I thought I might have some experts here in the room. So it's also thrilling always to speak about the history of the canal with people in the audience who have been there or perhaps spent time growing up there or had family members there. All right, so we begin with this image you see before you. Created by California artist Per Hamnall to celebrate the Grand World's Fair held in 1915, the Panama Pacific International Exposition, which itself was held to celebrate the completion of the Panama Canal. The lithograph before you, he called the 13th labor of Hercules. And with this image, he meant to suggest that the United States, here depicted as Hercules, had finally and triumphantly completed his 13th labor. This poster it's really an iconic image of the canal. It captures the triumphalist symbolism that the project offered to Americans. The canal as a great wonder of the world. And over the course of the 20th century, Knoll's poster was joined by many other depictions of the canal in prose, poetry, and visual images. In one of the most famous images, another individual portrayed himself as a Hercules, as the builder of the canal. This is, of course, one of the most famous presidential photographs ever taken, showing President Roosevelt sitting astride one of the gigantic steam shovels used for digging the canal. It was taken during a trip to the Isthmus to examine the construction project, the first time a sitting president had left the United States. And the photograph shows Roosevelt and the machine dominating the picture, preparing together to destroy a mountain. I like to compare these two images, the 13th labor of Hercules and this one of Roosevelt. Both focus on individuals, both demonstrate a bloodless conquest over nature. Each image eliminates the actual labor and the lived experience of the tens of thousands of working men and women who actually built the canal. But together, the images suggest the values U.S. officials wanted to associate with the canal project: American efficiency, scientific expertise, technological superiority, manliness, peerless leadership, and selfless gifts to world civilization. The United States successfully tied the construction project to these positive images, and the canal became the great idealistic symbol of America's beneficent power in the world. What interests me is a little bit different, and I want to share with you today the experiences of working men and women who built the canal, whose experiences are often erased by the emphasis on Roosevelt and steam shovels. But before we get to that, I don't want you to get me wrong. The building of the canal was indeed a spectacular achievement. Here's a quick map just to position us there in the canal zone. Imagine a 48-mile-long canal connecting the oceans. Gigantic locks that lift boats up 85 feet from sea level to the level of Gatun Lake, the largest man-made lake in the world at the time. To build this, workers had to dig through the Continental Divide and remove about 170 million cubic feet of dirt, build the huge lock gates, and deal with constant challenges. Here's an image of an avalanche. This gives you a sense of the heart of the canal project, as it was called at the time, Culebra Cut, when the canal dug through the Continental Divide. Notice the row upon row of trains going through, both carrying men, workers to the work site, and then carrying away the spoils of the digging. The incredible lock gates, spectacular project in and of itself. And often workers, with the constant downpours in Panama and the slides and avalanches, often workers having to dig out slides, working in water perhaps up to their waist. The effort was astonishing. Dynamite explosions going off all the time, trains lumbering, roaring by. Some people said, who were there at the time, that just the sound of the project was incredible, and the sound and the feeling of it as dynamite explosions made the ground tremble and as the trains roared by. Here's a quick image of the canal today, just to give you a sense of how it looked upon completion and still today. That gives you a little glimpse there in the corner of the expansion currently being undertaken by the Republic of Panama, itself a spectacular project. So the ships are lifted up through the gates, through the locks, up to the level of Gatun Lake, 85 feet above sea level. So how was the canal actually built? Years after it was completed, Chief Engineer George Goethals reflected upon the project. He had been chief engineer from 1907 until the canal's completion in 1914. He said everyone points to the medical miracles and engineering triumphs when discussing the canal, but in his view, those problems were solved by applying known strategies and principles. Eradicating yellow fever, for example, required tactics developed previously in Cuba, India, and Egypt. The true challenge presented by the canal construction, he argued, involved finding ways of, quote, ruling and preserving order within the canal zone. Creating a way to rule over men and women and maintain order, he believed, became his great achievement. In other words, the real challenge was a human challenge, managing all those people. I knew when I was researching the canal project, when I came upon that quote by Goethals, that I had found the hook for my book, because it so well articulated what I was seeing in my research. So the construction of the Panama Canal involved conquest over nature, to be sure, but also conquest over men and women. Building the canal required labor from as many as 45,000 working men at a time, from elite officials and foremen to steam shovel engineers and machinists and carpenters to unskilled laborers, diggers, and dynamiters, and onward to the women who worked as laundresses, cooks, domestic servants, and prostitutes. The vast majority were unskilled laborers from the West Indies, so Caribbean workers of African descent, reaching numbers as high as 30,000 at a time. But there were also 5,000 to 6,000 US citizens and a few thousand Southern and Northern Europeans. Besides the men and some women who worked for a wage in the canal zone, many women migrated to the zone to be with their menfolk, to keep house for them, and often children came with them or were born in zone hospitals. And to provide for this new population, government officials sure I've got my timer working. Government officials created the full infrastructure required by civilized life: a fire department, post office, police force, housing, cafeterias, hotels, a judicial system, jails, and a penitentiary. And what did it take to develop new ways of ruling over men and women, as Goethals had put it? Government officials developed a number of key tools for meeting this challenge: a pervasive system of segregation, a large police force, far-reaching powers to deport anyone, quote, deemed inessential to the construction project, a sometimes harsh judicial system, and an assertive military presence and foreign policy that ensured the Republic of Panama would be subservient to the needs of the United States. Goethals himself rejected democracy proudly and refused to recognize unions. He would not meet with any committee representing the workforce. Instead, he opened his office to anyone who had a problem or a grievance on Sunday mornings, and it was said that he was well liked by the workforce despite his rather strict and authoritarian approach. One observer noted, for example, that Colonel Goethals was quite popular in the zone. His authority only rarely questioned, and those who did question it, this man added, would likely find themselves immediately deported back to the United States. The fact is, although Goethals and his officials struggled hard to create in the canal zone an efficient machine for constructing the canal, the tens of thousands of people from all over the world repeatedly challenged and resisted that brilliant machine. And so often, really what my work has focused on is that often the officials had to revise and tweak their machine and their policies in order to keep things running as smoothly as possible. So let's explore this by, I'll just show you some images of the project to give a sense of some of these tensions and how they were worked out. This is one of the commissaries built throughout the zone. And right away you get a sense of one of the keys to labor management, the system of segregation. If you look close, you see the words silver and gold over each of the entrances. This refers to the system of labor management that really pervaded the entire project. Skilled white U.S. workers were gold workers. They were paid in gold, and life for them in the zone was considered to be a veritable utopia. They received free housing, much higher wages than they would get in the United States, and a month's paid vacation every year and a steamship ticket home to the United States. Workers from the Caribbean were the silver workers, paid in silver and living in conditions very different from those of the gold workers. Now, it's not surprising at all that segregation would have shaped labor relations in the canal zone. This was a period when segregation was widespread in the United States as well. What interests me is not so much that life was segregated, but rather the ways this caused problems for U.S. officials, in part because they were using a dual system, a biracial system, in a world that was much more complicated demographically, with people of many different races and ethnicities from all over the world. Here's a typical labor train that would be taking workers to the site to Calibra Cut, for example. These images just to give you a sense of what life was like. Dinner for white U.S. citizens at Gorgona Hotel. Dinner for Caribbean workers. Their dining area is really too fancy a term for it. No chairs would be provided. During a downpour of rain, they would find a tree to sit under or under a building. Housing for U.S. citizens. This is a picture of D.D. Gaillard, for whom Gaillard Cut, it used to be called Calibra Cut, now it's Gaillard Cut, named for him because he was the engineer who designed the work through that key part of the canal. So he's not a typical working class guy by any means. He's one of the top officials. But this picture gives you a sense of the kind of the determination of the U.S. to create a sense of civilized, respectable American life for U.S. citizens in the zone. Here's housing for a West Indian family. And this is a West Indian neighborhood. You can see the children playing. One striking thing about this photograph is the stagnant water you see there in front of the houses at a time when elimination of disease is a primary concern, getting rid of stagnant water. It's interesting to see that there. For the US citizens, providing an entertaining social life was important, and so YMCA clubhouses were built throughout the zone. In fact, the white US citizen workers, about 6,000 of them there, emerged as very important parts of the construction project. Their labor was absolutely crucial. It was important not to have them rushing back to the United States unhappy with working conditions. And gradually they emerged as key enforcers of the segregation system, in part because other forms of fighting for their rights and interests were closed off to them. They weren't allowed, for example, to have unions or to use union strength. They couldn't strike because they would be deported. This, ironically, though, made them vulnerable. They were ultimately hurt by that same segregation system because the United States, gradually to cut costs, began a policy of replacing them with lower paid West Indians who could do the same work. And this begins towards the middle or end of the construction decade. This begins to happen across the isthmus. West Indians will be trained, for example. Here you see a blacksmith shop. It's a gigantic place, right? Some of the most advanced industrial sites in the world at the time were in the canal zone. So in this blacksmith shop, you see a small number of US citizens in the front, backed up by a veritable army of West Indian blacksmiths who are called blacksmith helpers, but gradually they've been trained to do the same work that US citizens had been doing, and the number of US citizens employed gradually drops. So the United States increasingly is relying on West Indians, especially from Barbados and Jamaica, to do the work. And yet, the United States, it remains a little bit unhappy with the work the Caribbean workers are doing. They feel they don't work energetically enough. Sometimes they're difficult to manage. And so the United States feels that they need another source of workers. So the United States government decides to try the experiment of importing Spaniards, thinking the Spaniards will work more energetically and perhaps be easier to manage. Here's a photograph of Spaniards. So you tell me, do you think these guys look like they're going to be easy to manage? I don't think so. The Spaniards were more energetic, but not in the way that US officials had bargained for. Spaniards arrived like these gentlemen. They had been shown in Spain fancy brochures of nice hotels and cafeterias they would have access to, but when they got to the canal zone, they were told that those were only for whites. They were referred to as semi-white Spaniards. Same with, in smaller numbers, Italians came and Greeks. Similarly, they were excluded from the white hotels and cafeterias. So Spaniards like these were absolutely furious at the conditions and at their exclusion. For me as a labor historian, I might add, researching labor conditions in the zone as a labor historian, you're always looking for examples of tensions or issues or problems, because that's what you love to analyze. And at first I'm finding nothing. And then one day in the National Archives, an archivist lets me go up into the stacks, and I see a whole long shelf of boxes, all of which say labor disturbances. And I'm like, okay, thank goodness, something fun to analyze. And all the boxes, everything in them was these guys. All these troubles. If they're in a cafeteria for Europeans and the US is crazy enough to have an Italian cook their food, food riot. If they have working conditions they don't like, they're going on strike. At one point, some of them threatened to blow up the canal, much to the shock of the officials. And so gradually, this is another example of how officials had to constantly rethink things. In this case, the Spaniards were more than they bargained for. An anarchist movement spreads throughout the isthmus, and so gradually the US decides not to bring in more Spaniards. The US decided maybe if more women were present in the zone, it would help keep men content and create a more civilized atmosphere. So they began creating encouragements to women to come and join the project. Here's an image of some of the very important nurses playing a role in the hospitals of the zone. Some women like these came for jobs, but others came as housewives to create a civilized home for their husbands. That again created problems for officials. It created a greater pressure to have the zone feel up to the standards of a woman. Goethals investigators found themselves having to intervene to keep the peace in different neighborhoods, had to make sure there were supplies and foods available in the commissaries that women believed were necessary for a civilized household. So through it all, through all the tensions and the revising of policies, the work continued. And when it was done in 1914, the United States had not only consolidated its empire, but had done so in a way that seemed to project its strengths in a positive and beneficent way. These individuals are looking out from the steps of the headquarters of the Isthmian Canal Commission, looking out over the town of Balboa, which the US government built to house its workforce and its administrative staff for the canal. So to probe a little more deeply into some of these themes, I thought I would zero in on two people's lives and how they fit into the construction project, and see what they can tell us about the lived experience, the struggles and challenges that people faced in the canal zone. I begin by looking more closely at the work and the lives of Caribbeans in the canal zone. As we've seen, tens of thousands of West Indians or Afro-Caribbeans traveled to the canal zone to work on the canal, people like these coming from Barbados. For them, work on the canal was in many ways an opportunity to improve their lives. On their home islands, they had typically worked as landless agricultural laborers enmeshed in poverty. By traveling to the Isthmus of Panama, they embarked on an adventurous journey, becoming cosmopolitan globetrotters and launching actually a vast diasporic movement that would lead many of them onward to other parts of North and South America. In the canal zone, they certainly faced great dangers and hardship, but they also felt pride at the work they were doing. Many were able to save money and return home, able to buy some land of their own and so achieve some economic self-sufficiency. Others migrated onward to Central American plantations, or, if they could manage it, to new lives in Brooklyn or Harlem. I want to tell you, a story of a man named Constantine Parkinson, who was one of these Caribbeans, but unusual in some ways. We know a fair amount about Constantine because in 1963 he wrote up his experiences and entered a competition for the best true story of construction days. Interested in his story and in those of others who entered the competition, I traveled recently to St. Louis to search for his personnel records, and I found it. Here he is. This is one of the most important documents that exists in anyone's personnel record from the canal construction days, the application for a photo metal check. And you can see in this that tells you a lot of the basic information about an employee, where he's from, his physical characteristics, his job, and of course, one of the best things is it gives you a picture of the person in question. Here's a close-up of Constantine. The unusual thing about Constantine was that he was actually born on the Isthmus in 1894. His father, originally from Jamaica, had worked on the canal project when it was being led by the French in the 1880s. Parkinson was just a young boy when the United States acquired control over the zone in 1904. And then I can just imagine him watching as, like a hurricane hitting the Isthmus, the Americans built roads and bridges, housing, cafeterias, hotels, and commissaries. A few years later, as a young teenager, Parkinson took a job as a flagman in a surveyor's gang, clearing a path to build a railroad. In that first year alone, Parkinson changed jobs 2 more times, working as a water boy and then as a chainman with a different survey gang. In the next years, he changed jobs repeatedly. Finally, in 1913, he got a plum job for a Caribbean worker as a railroad brakeman. What must it have been like to be a worker like Constantine, helping to build the canal? West Indian workers confronted premature dynamite explosions, landslides, steam shovels toppling over, cranes swinging quickly by and crushing heads as they went, railroad accidents, falls from scaffolding while building the enormous locks and gates, and all the various diseases, especially malaria. One man wrote, quote, "I came wet to my home, and I leave for work in rain." Workers often began their workday in clothes still wet from the day before. Constantine remembered various fears and terrors that cast a shadow during the years he worked on the canal. He watched one time as a landslide swallowed a large number of workers, most of them Europeans. Workers, he said, toiled day and night to dig the bodies out of the dirt and rocks, finding money tied around the waist of many of the dead men, the safest place in the eyes of Spaniards to keep the money they were saving. In construction days, Constantine concluded, people get killed and injured almost every day, and all the bosses want is to get the canal built. One day, Parkinson unfortunately joined the ranks of West Indians injured on the job. In 1913, 18 years old and working still as a brakeman, he fell victim to a train accident. Rushed to the hospital in Cologne, he underwent surgery to amputate one of his legs. Doctors feared he would lose his life, but Parkinson survived. And years later, he still remembered what he saw upon awakening after the surgery. He said, "I notice all kinds of cripples around my bed, without arms, foot, one eye, telling me to cheer up, not to fret. We all good soldiers." The accident, for a time, ended Parkinson's service on the construction project. After waiting a year, he returned to the hospital where doctors fitted him with an artificial leg. Quote, "It was a big day for me, returning home, as many said that I would not live." Now, until I went to St. Louis, to the branch of the National Archives there, Constantine's story ended there. But in the personnel records, I learned the rest of his story. He actually worked for about 40 more years for the canal. The U.S. found jobs that he could do as watchman, And he pushed the US government in letters of negotiation I found back and forth. He pushed for the government to provide him with new artificial leg as the medical technology improved, and the US government did that. So his is a story, to be sure, of tragedy and heartache, but it's also one of remarkable endurance and successful negotiations with the government to ensure decent treatment. Second, I'll share with you the story of one of the housewives who went to the Canal Zone, the story of Rose Van Hardenveld, one of the thousands of women. I don't have a picture of Rose, I'm sorry to say, but I found this lovely photograph of a husband and wife that maybe can help us evoke the world of Rose. Like the Caribbean canal workers, women's roles have largely been written out of the dominant story of the canal. In 1905, Rose's husband left to take a job building the canal, and Rose and her daughters waited for the call to join him. Finally, she said she received word that she and her daughters could come, and as their ship slowly made its way to Panama, Rose read and reread the letters her husband had sent. For the first time, she said, I began to picture Panama as home. Indeed, that was her job, really. Her challenge and her job was to make Panama feel like home for her husband and for other workers, to make a place that felt civilized, nurturing, and safe. So housewives, here's another photograph of women and child. Housewives were playing an important role. They typically hired West Indians or Panamanians to cook and clean for them. And many of the most important tensions in the Canal Zone fell to them to negotiate. The home, the private home, became one of the most important contact zones, in other words, between US citizens and Caribbeans and Panamanians. So the private home, the home these women were building, became an important part of the project to build American civilization. So let us imagine Rose Van Hardenveld arriving in Panama in early 1906. She was among the first US housewives to arrive there. Her husband, Jan, greeted her and her daughters at the dock. They boarded a train headed for their new home in a construction town. As they got off the train, they walked along railroad tracks in what Rose called the blackest, darkest place I had ever been in, middle of the night. When they reached the house, her husband had no matches, so he let his family rest on the porch while he went to find a light. Rose sat clutching her children, she said, with fleeting mental pictures of the creeping horrors that might pounce on us out of the dark night. Jan returned, and you can imagine the key turning in the lock, and upon entering their new home, they saw hundreds of bats and lizards scurrying for cover. And then, as they gained their bearings, a vile smell hit them. Jan explained why. The house had been built and abandoned by the French, left unoccupied for many years, and built with double walls. The dwelling had provided a home for many bats, their nests and droppings, now filling the house. So against what must have been a horrifying experience, Rose held tight to her beliefs. It was her wifely duty to support and provide companionship to her husband. Furthermore, she and her husband passionately supported Theodore Roosevelt and felt a patriotic pride in his canal project. With Teddy Roosevelt, Jan Van Hardenveld had proclaimed to his wife, "Anything is possible." Yet, housewives like Rose did face great challenges. They were incredibly invaded by ants and other insects. They had trouble finding efficient servants. They dreaded disease, and they often feared the many people around them who did not hail from the United States. One incident in Rose's memoir speaks best, I think, to the tension she felt between her civilizing mission and her fears about the people and country around her. And given that we're approaching Christmas, this story is a very apt one. For a housewife like Rose, the holiday time was a very special one. It gave her a chance to show off her homemaking skills and to share her family's domestic life with bachelor canal workers. So she excitedly planned a large Christmas dinner. The commissary stocked obvious Christmas fixings like cranberries and mincemeat. The Van Hartevelds used boards and boxes to create a table large enough for all. Again, this is not the Hartevelds, but I can just imagine this long table with so many people. They didn't have enough silver or linen to go and not enough dishes, yet she said there was American food and how these fellows did eat. The dinner table was uproarious with talk and laughter. She said the day was glorious, bright and sunny and not too hot because of a delightful breeze that blew onto the veranda. Yet even in this moment of domestic triumph, the anxieties of empire did not disappear. As the family and guests sat on the porch after dinner, she related, watching as nighttime fell, they heard a commotion, and looking down the hill, they saw a group of quote-unquote dusky figures headed up towards their home. They wondered what the group had come to steal. They saw the men were carrying sticks and pipes, and they began to suspect impending violence. Rose wondered what she should do to protect her family, and then, suddenly, the group of men clustered together in front of their home and began singing Christmas carols to the family. The sticks and pipes they had brought to use as instruments, and they began bursting out into Silent Night and God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. Rose was touched and relieved. Her husband bounced down the stairs, thanked the carolers, and handed out coins before ushering them away. While the fine Christmas dinner had allowed Rose to feel they had transplanted America to the Isthmus and created a home for bachelor friends, the carolers helped her remember, she said, that, quote, we were still in the tropics after all. Over the years, Rose gradually learned to appreciate the West Indians around her and even at times to admire them. Yet, as the story suggests, she never completely escaped the anxieties she felt on the Isthmus. I'll just conclude by pulling together a few thoughts from the stories of Constantine and Rose. Their stories are just two that we could tell out of the tens of thousands, almost 200,000 people all in all, who traveled through the Isthmus in that decade of construction. Focusing in on these two, I believe, provides greater texture and depth to our understanding of the epic construction of the Panama Canal. Completed in 1914, just as war was breaking out in Europe, the Panama Canal became over time a pivotal symbol floating across America's 20th century. It helped to forge America's self-definition as a nation and as a world power, and provided a model for how to present expansionism as employing the best ideas of America as virtuous and as a gift to world civilization. Images like Perhamnal's shaped how Americans perceived the canal and its construction. Yet I've argued tonight that if we look more closely at the actual tensions and struggles in the canal zone, we'll see that the world there was far from the simple triumphalist image that the United States projected to the world. George Goethals had said his major contribution lay in managing the people side of the construction project, ruling over the men and women there. So the Herculean labor involved in building the canal was not just the work of moving mountains, but also work involving thousands and thousands of working men and women. Constantine Parkinson and Rose Van Hardenveld were two of those people. The real canal builders were people like them who had their own dreams and desires and anxieties, who navigated through complex and unknown territories, and who struggled to build for themselves a strong and satisfying life. I hope if you travel through the Panama Canal, you'll remember the true but often unsung canal builders, the people like Constantine and Rose. Thank you so much. All right, and I think we certainly have time for any questions. Yes?
Do you know if the Tivoli Hotel is still there?
The question was, is the Tivoli Hotel still there? My understanding is that it's not. Were you there?
I was a stewardess at Pan American, and we stayed overnight there.
Ah.
And it was wood, you know, it was on top of a hill. And we pulled our switch in our closet to keep our clothes from being sopping wet in the morning.
Oh my, this woman was saying she was a stewardess for Pan America and stayed at the Tivoli Hotel in the Canal Zone. How neat. What else? It's hard for me to see what they're like. Yes?
Are there many people born in the Canal Zone and who grew up in it alive today? And if so, have you interviewed any of them and recorded their memories?
Great. Yeah, the question was, are there many people still alive today who grew up in the Canal Zone? And if so, have I interviewed them? My research, since I'm dealing with the early 20th century canal construction era, there aren't people still alive from that period. So I have not done any oral history work, but there are many people still alive, and there are several different oral history projects, very exciting, going on to try and capture and preserve the memories of those who grew up in the Canal Zone, both U.S. citizens and others as well. Really a great source for anyone interested in oral history of the Canal Zone would be the Oral History Project at the University of Florida, actually. It's a great resource. Yes?
Could you comment on some of the scientific or engineering achievements, such as the victory, so to speak, over yellow fever that much written about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The question was, would I comment on the engineering or medical achievements involved in the construction of the Panama Canal? And yeah, I don't, in my talk, I don't usually focus on those just because others have written on them and it's not my forte, but it certainly is true that the engineering and medical achievements were incredible and fascinating in and of themselves. The decision to build a lock canal rather than a sea canal was a huge turning point in the construction. One of the great achievements of the U.S. also was in realizing the importance of the railroad. They tore out the railroad that had been built by the French and built a much more powerful, wider gauge railroad. And they used the railroad very, very strategically. The French had tended to dig and just leave the spoil right there, which led to many more avalanches. The United States realized that you needed to cart away the spoil, and in fact used it to reclaim land from the ocean, built thoroughfares out into the ocean, built the town of Balboa partly from reclaimed ocean. So that was huge. The U.S. invented many things, invented track movers, invented machines that could more easily move the spoil up onto the railroad beds. So all of that was hugely significant. Medically, the big breakthrough, of course, was to realize the cause of malaria and yellow fever, to identify that it was spread by mosquitoes and to identify which mosquitoes they were, to realize that stagnant water and high grasses were both generating a larger mosquito population. And so the United States took major sanitation steps to eliminate stagnant water and to cut high grasses. The French, in the French period, 1880s, they had not realized the cause. One of the many tragedies of the French construction effort in the 1880s is the French had built hospitals, and there was a little ant that used to get into the hospitals and climb up hospital beds and bite patients. And so the French had put every leg of every hospital bed into a little cup of water so that these bugs could not climb up into the beds. And of course, this had led to massive spread of yellow fever throughout the French hospitals.
In the back.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Is there any idea as to how many lives were actually lost during the building process? Is there any figure on that?
Yes, it's the official United States estimate of lives lost during its construction effort is about 5,000. Scholars who have studied it believe that it was much higher, that it was probably more like 15 to 17,000 lives lost. The reason for the difference is that Caribbean workers, one of the few ways Caribbeans could control their lives was mobility. They would change their jobs, change their residences, change their names. They would leave the canal zone, refuse to live in government housing, and go live in Panama City or Cologne. And so as a result, it's difficult for the US government to track them. So if it was, say, 15,000, that would mean roughly 1 in 10 Caribbeans died. Most of those who died were Caribbean.
How do you view the attempt to build a new canal in Nicaragua?
Yeah, so I don't know if you all have heard, there's a project supposedly by a private Chinese company to build a canal in Nicaragua. I am not an expert on that, but I recently was at a symposium and heard someone who is studying it, and he argues that the Chinese will never build a canal through Nicaragua, that it would be way too expensive, and the deal they have negotiated, although it gives them the power if they want to build a canal, he argues that in fact what they will do is build a pipeline. I think, I'm not Nicaraguan, but I think it's remarkable that the Nicaraguan government has given so much power over to a private corporation based in China, whether it ends up as a canal or a pipeline or whatever. In the back? Yeah.
I'm curious how the organizational structure dealt with the language barrier, Spanish and English, and I'm struck that the large number of workers were English-speaking. They were Barbadian or Jamaican, and that was probably strategic. But what did they do with the indigenous Panamanians, and did they move Panamanian Spanish-speaking locals into managerial positions? And did they segment off the Gallegos, the Galicia, and I couldn't read the other one, Cascados, people from certain parts of Spain? Did they tier their management structure for Spanish-speaking and English-speaking workers, or did they just mix them all together?
That's a really great question. The question was, how did the US government deal with language differences, English versus Spanish, for example, and one could add French, because many of the workers, especially in the early years, were from Martinique, from the French Caribbean. One of the interesting things about the construction project was watching the government decide from where to get its workers. And one of the fabulous things about the National Archives is there's a section of the archives, if you can talk an archivist to take you back into the stacks, that's organized by country. And for each country, A through Z, you can watch the dialogue between the US government and that country, and you can see how the government is deciding where to get workers from. Mexico, the workers are too troublesome, for example. Originally, they didn't want Caribbean workers at all. The chief engineer at the time, John Stevens, wanted Chinese workers, very much because he had built US railroads using Chinese, but he was refused that. And in fact, he resigned literally within 24 hours after being told by the US Attorney General he would not be allowed to import Chinese. So the U.S. settled on Afro-Caribbeans, and I think a big reason for it was their English language abilities. Panamanians, on the other hand, the U.S. used very few Panamanians, about 2,000. And the reason was that they felt they would be too hard to manage and discipline. And they tended to use them, as your question kind of indicated. The Panamanians either were the lowest of the low, clearing bush, really awful, horrible, hard, low-pay work, or they were white-collar personnel. You know, I do not know if there was a separate administrative labor management structure for people of different languages. I do know that because of the gold and silver payroll system, one of the tricky things for the US government was, where do Europeans, where do Spaniards or Italians fit within that dual system? Or where do African Americans fit? There were about 200 African Americans. The US could not house them and feed them with white US citizens, but they didn't feel comfortable housing them with Caribbeans either. So they created what they called an elevated silver roll for African Americans. And they did pretty much the same thing for the Spaniards and Italians. They couldn't put them with white US, they couldn't put them with Caribbeans, so they just created their own cafeterias and housing for them. A lot of times there were conflicts. This is about the closest I can get to exactly answering your question. There would be conflicts between workers if Spaniards were given a Greek foreman, for example. They would say, that Greek guy, he's just as mean as any American, you know, get rid of the Greeks. So there were often these kinds of ethnic tensions. Yeah.
What happened to the workers after the canal was built, specifically the ones in the Caribbean?
Yeah, great question. What happened to the workers after the canal was completed? That, especially the Caribbeans, that is a very dramatic part of the story as well. The United States, by 1912, started to realize that it had tens of thousands of workers that it needed to place elsewhere. And so the US government very energetically worked with the United Fruit Company, for example, with governments back in Barbados and Jamaica to try and make sure that the workers would move out and move onward to other jobs. So many did go home. Many did go on to plantations in Costa Rica or northern Panama, but many remained in Panama itself. And you know, if you've been in Panama, you know there's a very strong sort of Caribbean feel to the country as a result of the canal construction. But especially in those early days when the canal was just being completed, there was a real sense of turmoil and transformation. You know, the United States moved people out of towns. Many of the towns of the zone, if you remember the map I showed earlier, many of those old construction towns became literally underwater as Gatun Lake was flooded. Others that were on the far side of the canal weren't flooded, but the U.S. dismantled them, and so there was a massive project to relocate people. There's a historian actually writing a book specifically on this project of depopulating the canal upon completion of the project. Okay, I think we better stop. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight, those of you in person here and those of you online. Thanks again to our exhibition sponsors, PNC Wealth Management, Enterprise Holdings Foundation, Florida Division of Cultural Affairs, Palm Beach County Cultural Council, and Palm Beach County